think of demand, we think of various customers at a supermarket buying different stuff. Well, that is technically demand, but from the economy point of view, there are different aspects of demand. And today, we're going to explore demand and obviously supply. Hi everybody, I'm a hero guru Ronnie and welcome to Many Mastermind. Today we're going to see the topic of demand and supply. Now, demand and supply have two different aspects, the micro level and the macro level. So micro level is like the individual level, the teeny tiny level, micro level. Macro level is when we see the entire economy as a whole. Now, in micro level, we learn about individual demand and individual supply. Individual demand is like the demand for a certain commodity, okay? So that's the demand of a certain commodity. And individual supply is the supply of a certain commodity. But when we see aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we see the demand and supply of, all the commodities in the economy. So like the demand of all commodities, all kinds of commodities, the supply of all kinds of commodities. So today we're going to talk on the macro level of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, But let me give a brief description of individual demand and individual supply. And if you think that you want to learn micro first and macro later, I'll be creating another video on micro sometime. Maybe there might be a slight delay because of stuff. And yeah, I know I haven't been on this channel for a very long time, but I'll try my best to make up for it. So, there might be some delay in the micro video, but I'll try to upload it whenever I can. And try to make it as well, obviously. So, first of all, what is individual demand? Individual demand is the demand for a certain commodity. Okay, so the demand for a certain commodity is individual demand. And we create a demand schedule to showcase the demand at different prices. So in a demand schedule, a table drawn for showing the quantity demanded at different prices, we have price in one column and quantity demanded in another. And at different prices, we keep on showing the quantity demanded. Now, it's a human tendency that whenever the price is low, we demand more, okay, except for certain exceptions. But whenever the price is low, most objects, we demand more because it's easier to buy those. We have more purchasing power. So we can say that when price is less, demand is more, and when price is more, demand is less. So that means there's an inverse relationship between demand and price. And demand and income have a positive relationship because the more income you have, the more things you can demand. So actually, demand is the ability and the willingness to buy something, okay? And now look, demand is a flow constant, which means it's measured over a period of time, not at a point of time. We'll say, what was the demand for the past 1 year, not what is the demand right now, because there is no such thing as demand right now, all right? Now, coming back to individual demand, what we see is that there's price and quantity demanded, right? Now, we've often heard of market demand. Is it the same as aggregate demand? The answer is no. Market demand is way different from aggregate demand. Market demand is all the demand for a certain commodity. But aggregate demand, on the other hand, is all the demand of all the commodities, right? So all kinds of demand together sum up as aggregate demand, but all kinds of demand for a certain commodity sums up to be market demand. So aggregate demand is a much wider concept than market demand. Now, when we create a demand curve, it becomes, like there's an inverse relationship between price and demand. So it's a downward sloping curve. And the demand curve is just made by plotting the different points on the graphic. And now let's look at individual supply. Individual supply is like, the opposite of demand. You supply more when the price is more because you make bigger profits. And, well, there is no certain fixed relationship of supply with income because supply is from the producer's point of view. And what happens is that producers can take huge loans and their ideas innovative, so there isn't a real big problem of income. Now what happens is that since the supply curve is positive, it's upward sloping, and the demand one is downward sloping. So what happens is that there's a certain intersection of them if you plot them together, and that intersection is called equilibrium. That is the point where there's neither a surplus nor a deficit. Like, there isn't a shortage nor a surplus. There isn't too less supply or too much. So it's a perfect point where this economy is at a stage of equilibrium, okay? Now what happens if the economy deviates from equilibrium? What happens then is that if there's a surplus, most of the output will remain left over as stock. So what will happen is that producers will cut plant output, and because they want to sell their products, they will make the prices fall till it reaches equilibrium. And if there's a shortage, then what will happen is that buyers will bid up the price till it reaches the equilibrium. So that is when it comes to, the demand and supply relationship. Now there are various aspects of individual demand, like elasticity of demand and many other concepts, but we'll be learning this in a different video, which let's hope I'll upload soon in the future. And individual supply is just like individual demand, but the total opposite, So demand and supply are two different concepts from the perspective of consumers and producers. Now that's all about individual demand. What about aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Now, before we start aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we must understand the basic concept of the circular flow of income. Now, in the circular flow of income, there are two entities, the households and the firms. Okay, so there are the households and the firms. Now, what happens is that the households supply their factor services to the firms, like, all the factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. All those four factors of production are provided by the household. So they provide factor services, in return for which they get factor payments or factor incomes for them. So factor incomes include stuff like wages and salaries, interest, profits, and rents. So that is the factor incomes. Now what do they do with the factor incomes? Well, they use it for consumption expenditure on the goods in the market, right? And in return for the consumption expenditure, they get goods and services. Now what happens is that we can see aggregate demand is like the willingness and ability to buy, and aggregate demand sometime in the future is going to get converted into aggregate expenditure. So the aggregate demand for a year equals the aggregate expenditure for the same year. Like this, all that is produced will somewhat be converted into income. So aggregate supply equals national income. Now we've understood this basic concept, okay? So in a two-sector closed economy where there are only households and firms, AE, or AD now, equals C plus I, consumption plus investment. Since there's no government, there will be no government expenditure, and since there's no foreign sector, there will be no exports minus imports or net exports. So since there are not two things of the equation, there's C plus I. And we all know that income equals consumption expenditure plus saving. So C plus I, when it equals C plus S, is the equilibrium. When AD equals AS, or C plus I equals C plus S, it's equilibrium. Now if we remove the C's, we can say when S equals I, it's equilibrium. So we know that when AD equals AS, S equals I, and when S equals I, AD equals AS. Now that is all about the basics. Now let's shift a step further. Consumption and investment. Now obviously in our syllabus we have investment as autonomous investment that doesn't change depending on the level of income. So that is technically not how investment works. And yes, it does increase with an increase in income, but let's just consider investment to be autonomous. Now we've noticed that even at zero level income, there is some amount of aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. That's because there is autonomous consumption and autonomous investment. Now, although autonomous investment is much more complex concept in reality, let's forget about that and focus on autonomous consumption, which occurs all the time with us. Even if your income is zero, like many families were having during the COVID pandemic, then also you have to spend something for, eating, living. You don't want to die. Just because you have no income doesn't mean you necessarily die. Alright, so what happens is that you need some money, some expenditure for sustenance, and we get that money from savings or borrowings. So we've mainly been introduced to savings, right? When the amount of consumption expenditure is greater than our incomes, there is negative savings. When the amount of consumption is equal to our earnings, when all we use as consumption expenditure or all that we consume is equal to what we earn, then it is called the break-even point, where savings equals zero. And actually that's the point where the consumption curve and the income curve or the aggregate supply curve intersect. So what happens is that is the point which is break-even point. After that, savings begin. Now that was the concept of income and consumption. So autonomous consumption, now we've understood what it is. And we need to know that aggregate demand and consumption are parallel to each other, because right now we're considering that investment is autonomous, meaning it's same at all the levels of income, so the difference is the amount of investment between A, D, and C. Now we gotta learn the different components of aggregate expenditure. Well, that I've derived an acronym which isn't good, but I guess it can do. It's SIGN, okay, and I couldn't think of a better acronym, sorry, but SIGN. C for consumption, I for investment, G for government expenditure, and N for net exports. In a four-sector economy, that is, the practical components. C stands for consumption. It's what us households do, right? Consumption expenditure. Then there's I, which is done by businesses. Then there's G, government expenditure, done obviously by the government. Then there's net exports, which is exports minus imports, alright? Now, why is it exports minus imports? Exports is the amount of goods demanded from abroad, and imports are just the opposite of exports. So exports is actually adding to our demand, so imports should decrease it, right? So exports minus imports, or net exports, are also a component of AD. Now, private consumption expenditure includes private consumption expenditure done by households and private consumption expenditure done by businesses. Government expenditure includes government consumption expenditure and government investment expenditure. Now, investment is also known as gross domestic capital formation, and this is divided into gross domestic fixed capital and gross domestic fixed capital formation, or fixed investment, and change in stock or inventory investment. Change in stock is rather easy, closing stock minus opening stock. This might even be negative. And about fixed investment, what happens is that gross domestic fixed capital formation consists of all of the investment done by businesses plus investment on residential construction done by households. Net exports is just, exports minus imports. Quick note, aggregate supply and aggregate demand refer to the planned demand or desired demand, and planned supply or desired supply. Remember, these aren't the actual demand or actual supply. Like, for example, there's ex-ante and ex-post, right? Ex-ante is the planned and ex-post is the actual. So here we're talking about the ex-ante demand and ex-ante supply, not the ex-post. Now, what happens is that now we gotta learn about aggregate supply. What is aggregate supply? We can say aggregate supply is the planned production of all goods and services in the economy during the period of one accounting year. Now, what happens is that is the definition of aggregate supply. We all know aggregate supply is equal to income, to national income, because supply is always converted into income, right? Alright, and the schedule of supply is shown that aggregate supply is always equal to income. So like there's income, there's consumption, there's saving, right? And consumption, when consumption is like, for example, 30 and income is 0, then saving will be minus 30. So what happens is that we consider AS equals C plus S, right? And what happens is that AS equals C plus S, which means 30 plus minus 30 equals 0. So AS equals Y. That's all that is demonstrated in the schedule. And then when we plot a curve, we create a 45-degree straight line. And why so? Because on one axis we have aggregate supply, on the other we have income or GDP. So what happens is national income and aggregate supply will always be equal, so there's a 45-degree line, okay, showing a very perfect same-to-same relationship between income and aggregate supply. Now, that was about aggregate supply and income. What about consumption function and saving function? Now, we all know C plus S equals AS, right? Consumption plus saving equals aggregate supply. There is consumption function and saving function. Consumption function is like the functional relationship between consumption and income. Now, consumption function has two aspects, EPC and MPC. EPC is average propensity to consume, MPC is marginal propensity to consume. So you can create a table, for example, like a schedule of consumption and different levels of income. Now what happens is that when you've created that consumption at different levels of income, we just subtract the amount of consumption from the income and we derive savings, right? So we can plot, we can write the income according to ourselves from your thought process or anything. And at times, just to ensure uniformity right now in your syllabus, people have made it easier for you. So CBSE has made it easier for you. That's why there's a uniform difference, okay? Like an increase in 40, 40, 40, 40, 40 continuously. But often our increase in consumption also changes. So yeah, but what you have to do is you have to do a uniform increase in consumption and a uniform increase in income. The increase in income should preferably be at a faster rate than consumption, because that's how it actually works, and that's what we're also known to. Because what happens is that as your income increases, you start getting less and less interested in spending it, because you've already got a lot by spending it already at a lower income. So there are either very crazy people who keep on buying more and more and more and more and more expensive stuff. At a time we just get satisfied with what we've got. Like, I've already got 20 nice sofas. How many do I want anymore? So what happens is that there's this satisfying level. Okay, once we've reached that, we start decreasing our level of consumption. But over here, our rate of consumption always is lower than our rate of increase in income. That's a fundamental truth. So we're going to apply that concept to our schedule as well. Now we're going to see consumption function and saving function. Consumption function includes APC and MPC. APC is average propensity to consume. So average propensity to consume means at a certain income, how much do we consume? What amount of it do we consume? So it's C upon Y. How much of an income do we consume? For example, if C upon Y equals 0.8, for example, okay? So C upon Y equals 0.8, that means 0.8 of the income we have at this point, that much we consume. Now what happens is that APC keeps on changing. But if we ensure a uniform increase, then MPC will remain the same. Because what happens is that MPC is the change in consumption upon the change in income. So the increase in consumption upon the increase in income, then you'll say, wait, isn't that the slope of the C curve? Yes, it is. It's just delta C upon delta Y, change in consumption upon change in income, which is exactly the slope of the C function. So we can say that the slope of the C line equals the MPC. not the APC. Okay, APC is C upon Y, not delta C upon delta Y. So MPC is the rate at which consumption increases with an increase in income. And right now we're being taught about a constant level of MPC or slight minor changes, but in real life, MPC changes as well. Now, what happens is that's APC and MPC, but what about APS and MPS? Yep, same concept, but just for savings. APS is the amount of savings at a particular amount of income. Okay, so it's S upon Y, and MPS is the slope of the S line. It's delta S upon delta Y, which is change in saving upon change in income. So with a certain amount of change in income, how much is there a change in savings? Now what happens is that obviously MPS is also the slope of the S line. So now let's discuss different possibilities of APC, MPC, APS, and MPS. So first, APC. Can it be negative? No, it cannot, because neither consumption nor income can be negative. Consumption, no, because there's always autonomous consumption, and income, absolutely not, because income is always either 0 or greater than 0. Then there is, can APC can be 0? No, it can't be 0, because consumption can never be 0. APC can be less than 1 when consumption is, less than income. Like when we start saving, that moment we have less than 1 APC, because C upon Y equals APC, right? Now C upon Y equals APC, that means C should be less than Y to get something less than 1. So whenever C is less than Y at higher income levels, then we get APC as less than 1. APC is 1 when there's a break-even point, C equals Y. And APC is greater than 1 when C is greater than Y. Okay, that's when we do negative savings, when we start consuming stuff with or without our income. Sometimes there is a mixture of income and savings. Now that was APC. Now what about MPC? Can it be negative? No, it can't be negative. Obviously, change in consumption and change in income can never be negative. Okay, we're only seeing an increase, not a decrease. So change in consumption and change in income can never be negative, so MPC can never be negative. Can it be 0? No. Change in income and change in consumption can never be 0. Okay, and can it be less than 1? Well, obviously it can be less than 1 if, only a certain amount of the change in Y is converted into change in consumption. The rest of the extra additional Y is used as saving. That time it's less than 1. Can an MPC be 1? Yes. It can also be 1 because obviously if all the additional income is spent on consumption expenditure, then it'll be 1. Can it be greater than 1? No, are you crazy? It cannot be greater than 1 because simply saying your additional consumption cannot exceed your additional income. Like we're talking about the additional consumption out of your additional income. Now coming to APS. APS can be negative because savings can be negative savings. When consumption is greater than income, we have negative savings. So yes, APS can be negative. Can it be 0? Well, obviously it can be 0. During the break-even point, APS is in fact 0. Then can it be greater than 0 but lesser than 1? Like it's less than 1? Well, let's see. Can it be less than 1? Obviously it can be less than 1 because when we start saving, that's when it becomes less than 1. Can it ever be 1? No, it cannot be 1 or greater than 1. Greater than 1 is out of question, but it cannot be 1. When it cannot be 1, it can't be greater than 1 either. So it cannot be 1 because you have to have autonomous consumption. So, it can be 1. Can MPS be negative? No. Again, change in saving according to the change in income can never be negative. Can it be 0? Sure. When all the additional income that is earned is used for consumption expenditure.
can it be less than 1? Yes, it can. It can be less than 1 when a portion of the additional income is used as saving. And it can be 1 as well, because when all the additional income is used for saving, that time MPS equals 1. Now, can it be more than 1? No, it can't, because you can't have additional savings more than additional income. All right, now we've understood how far APS, APC, MPS, MPC can go. What about the relation between these? APS plus APC equals 1. What is APS? It's C upon Y, right? And what is MPS? What is APS? That's S upon Y, right? And what is APC? It's C upon Y. So S upon Y plus C upon Y equals S plus C upon Y, which equals Y upon Y, which equals 1. And when it comes to MPS MPS plus MPC, that's also equal to 1, because MPS is delta S upon delta Y, and MPC is delta C upon delta Y. So delta S upon delta Y plus delta C upon delta Y equals delta S plus delta C upon delta Y, which equals delta Y upon delta Y, which equals 1. So APS plus APC is always equal to 1. MPS and MPC is always equal to 1. But what is the reason behind this? Well, APS plus APC is always equal to 1 because what happens is that APS plus APC, all the income we have is either saved or is used for consumption expenditure. So that's why APS plus APC equals 1. And MPS plus MPC equals 1 as well, because the additional income we've earned is either used for saving or for consumption expenditure. Now, here are the algebraic expressions for the C function and not the S function. C function equals, what does C function equal? It equals C bar. What is C bar? Autonomous consumption. Consumption at the level of 0. Then considering, NPC is constant, then the NPC is represented by B here, okay? And then there's Y. Y is the income. So C equals C bar plus BY. C bar is autonomous consumption, and from there onward, we do BY, because all the additional income is multiplied by the NPC, and we get it. And saving obviously is the opposite of this, minus C bar, because all the autonomous consumption is actually negative savings, plus 1 minus B multiplied by Y. 1 minus B, because 1 minus MPC equals MPS multiplied by Y. Well, that's well done. And now we've explored not only how far can APS and APC go along with MPS and MPC, but we also learned the relationship between them. And on top of that, we also learned the algebraic expressions for C function and S function. So I just noticed this has become a pretty long video, and let's just keep it this short for part 1. I'll return with a part 2, part 3 showing short run equilibrium output and also deficient demand and excess demand. Then we'll shift to microeconomics. Hope it doesn't take me long to create the next video. Thanks and have a brilliant day. This is goodbye from Mini Money Mastermind.